At first light, the Roman fort was still alive. Hundreds of soldiers had made it through another bitter frontier night without radiators, electricity, insulated walls, or anything resembling modern central heating. But survival was never automatic. If the barrack fire died, if soaked clothing stayed wet, or if food stores began to fail, discipline alone could not keep a man warm enough to stand another watch. And that is the first myth to break. Roman soldiers did not survive northern winters because they were somehow tougher than cold, nor did every barrack hide a luxurious hypercaust beneath the floor. Ordinary troops depended on something far less glamorous: shelter, a shared hearth, wool clothing, grain, fuel, and a supply system that had to keep working day after day. One broken link could turn shelter into exposure. Rome's real winter weapon was not a heater. It was logistics. Long before the worst weather arrived, the army was already preparing for it. At Vindolanda, a frontier fort in northern Britain, 6 surviving fragments of a wooden writing tablet preserve a message from Flavius Cerealis, the commanding officer, to a man named September. The document dates to roughly AD 97 to 105. One damaged line still preserves a remarkably precise moment. Tomorrow was 5 October. Much of the message is fragmentary, but its surviving meaning is revealing. Cerealis expected to provide certain goods, apparently through purchase or payment, so that they could endure troublesome storms. The missing sections do not tell us exactly what those goods were. They may have been ordinary supplies rather than anything designed specifically for winter, but that is exactly what makes the document important. Weather had already entered military administration. Winter on the frontier did not begin when snow finally covered the ground. It began earlier, when worsening weather started increasing the cost of keeping men alive, supplied, and operational. Imagine Vindolanda as autumn closes in. The fort stands in exposed country near the northern edge of Roman power. Men still have watches to stand. Messages still have to move. Food still has to be prepared. Animals still have to be managed. Equipment still has to be maintained. A storm does not cancel military routine. It makes every part of it harder. Rain can soak clothing before a man reaches his post. Wind can pull heat from a room whenever the door opens. Mud can slow movement through the fort and along the roads beyond it. A soldier returning from duty does not simply need a roof over his head. He needs enough warmth and rest to do the same thing again. If preparation fails, the next watch still arrives. That is the quiet importance of Cerealis' tablet. It does not describe a heroic march through a blizzard. It records administration. Someone has identified a need. Someone has to obtain supplies. Someone has to pay for them or arrange their movement. A commander is dealing with weather before the season fully closes in. Roman power looked spectacular from the outside. A fort had gates, defensive works, weapons, disciplined troops, and roads connecting it to other positions. But none of those things made a cold soldier warm by themselves. A permanent frontier created a permanent obligation. Men consumed resources whether they were fighting or not. They ate while waiting. They burned fuel while sleeping. They wore out footwear on patrols where no enemy appeared. Their clothes still had to dry after a miserable watch. A campaign army might sometimes leave bad ground. A permanent garrison remained because the position itself mattered. So Rome faced a different kind of contest. Not one decisive battle, but the same test repeated every morning. Could the men wake warm enough to work? Could they eat enough to keep working? Could their clothing protect them through another wet watch? Could supplies arrive before stored reserves began to matter? To answer those questions, forget the marble villas for a moment. Walk into the soldiers' quarters. There, Roman winter survival became much smaller. The basic military household was the contubernium, traditionally a group of 8 men who lived and functioned together. Evidence from places such as Vindolanda shows hearths associated with barrack accommodation, while ordinary cooking vessels suggest that soldiers carried out much of their daily food preparation in or around their own living spaces. Now, reduce an empire to one room, 8 men, cloaks and equipment, leather footwear, cooking pots, a doorway opening onto cold air, and a fire. That hearth was not decoration. It could provide light, heat, and the means to cook. The barrack gave shelter, but shelter was not the same thing as warmth. That distinction matters because Roman engineers knew a far more sophisticated solution: At Chester's on Hadrian's Wall, the commanding officer's residence included a hypocaust. A furnace drove hot air through spaces beneath raised floors, heating the rooms above. Rome knew how to heat a building. But that technology was expensive infrastructure, not something an ordinary soldier could assume existed beneath his barrack bed. An officer might occupy heated rooms. Ordinary troops depended much more heavily on barrack fires, winter clothing, shared shelter, and communal heated facilities such as bathhouses. The technology existed, the everyday military solution remained much simpler: a fire in a room. And that simplicity created dependence. A hearth had to be fed. A weak fire meant a colder space. Wet clothes took longer to dry. A soldier who never fully warmed after one exposed shift carried that deficit into the next. The next sentry rotation did not care whether he had slept comfortably. If the barrack could no longer restore a man between duties, winter was no longer merely unpleasant. It was beginning to attack military readiness. The hearth had another job as well. Soldiers needed food, and cooking required heat. The same fire could sit at the center of several needs at once: warmth, light, food preparation, and the small routines that turned 8 armed men into a functioning military household. But the fire did not burn because Rome was powerful. Someone had to provide what it consumed. And even after a soldier had warmed himself beside it, eventually he had to leave. He had to dress, put his footwear back on, cross the threshold, and stand outside again. That is where one of the most persistent images of Roman military life begins to collapse. We picture soldiers in sandals, lower legs exposed, somehow marching through northern Britain as if cold rain were only an inconvenience. The surviving evidence is much more practical. At Vindolanda, one famous writing tablet records a package containing socks, 2 pairs of sandals, and 2 pairs of underpants. It sounds almost comically ordinary. That is exactly why it matters. These were not weapons or parade equipment. They were everyday pieces of clothing moving through the same frontier world as orders, grain, patrol reports, and military correspondence. Archaeology reinforces the picture. At Housesteads, an object preserves an image of a foot apparently wearing something like a substantial sock inside a sandal. At Halem Bridge, traces of woolen material survived through mineralization around the hobnails of Roman footwear. Romans were not too proud to wear socks with sandals. They were trying to keep their feet usable. For a soldier, that was not a fashion choice. It was operational. A shield could stop a blade. It could not stop water working through footwear hour after hour. A sentry still had to stand. A messenger still had to walk. A patrol still had to leave the gate. If feet became painfully cold, soaked, or damaged, the consequences spread through the entire body. The man walked differently. He tired faster. Rest became less effective. And the next duty still came. That is why winter clothing belonged to the same survival system as the barrack and the hearth. Socks, wool, undergarments, insoles, leather footwear, and cloaks were not simply comforts. They preserved mobility. What looked like personal clothing was operational protection. Vindolanda has produced thousands of leather shoes and boots in a remarkable range of sizes and styles, belonging to soldiers and civilians alike. The scale of the finds reminds us that the northern frontier was not populated by statues. It was populated by human beings whose feet had to survive mud, rain, wear, and cold. Picture one auxiliary before a morning watch. He has already left the warmth of the hearth. He pulls wool against his skin, checks his footwear, tightens whatever needs tightening, and steps onto a wet road inside the fort. Nearby, another man is doing the same. Then another. Nothing about the scene looks heroic. That is the point. Roman endurance was built from thousands of actions too ordinary to carve onto a monument. But clothing created another dependency. Leather wore out. Wool needed drying. Useful garments needed repair or replacement. If those small things stopped moving through the system for long enough, the fort might still possess walls, shields, spears, and swords. Its soldiers would simply become progressively harder to use. The famous equipment helped a Roman soldier fight. The forgotten equipment helped him reach the fight at all. And even a dry soldier beside a warm fire had another problem. His body was burning fuel. That fuel was food. Grain was one of the foundations of the Roman military diet. At Vindolanda, environmental evidence from granary contexts indicates that spelt wheat formed a major part of the cereals being stored, alongside other grains. Writing tablets show food moving through the frontier economy in measured quantities. One account records 55 modi of beans. Other records refer to grain products and supplies being bought, moved, or distributed. At nearby Magna, a bronze modius discovered in 1915 gives physical scale to those measurements. Its capacity has been interpreted as roughly equivalent to about a week's grain ration for one soldier. At first, that sounds reassuring. Fill the granary and the army is fed. Except grain in a granary is not yet a meal. Before soldiers could eat much of it as bread, somebody had to grind it. At Vindolanda, rotary quern stones have been recovered from military accommodation. One carries the name Africanus. Another surviving fragment appears to have belonged to Victor or Victorinus. Those names pull us suddenly out of a logistics diagram and into a room. A heavy upper stone had to be turned against the lower one again and again, crushing grain until flour appeared. Experimental estimates cited by the Vindolanda Trust suggest that producing enough flour for an 8-man contubernium could consume roughly 4 hours of grinding each day. 4 hours, not marching, not drilling, not standing on the wall, grinding grain. That is an extraordinary hidden cost. The grain could already be inside the fort, yet the men still needed hours of labor before much of it became the food they expected to eat. Rome could store calories in bulk, it still needed human effort to unlock them, and grinding was only part of the process. Flour became dough. Dough had to be baked. At Vindolanda, large ovens were positioned behind the fort's defenses near the Intervallum Road. The oven had to be heated, burning material and ashes managed, and bread cooked using the heat retained by the structure. Each step added another requirement. A soldier needed calories. Calories depended on grain. Grain depended on storage and supply. Much of it required grinding. Bread required an oven. The oven required fuel. Analysis of material from Vindolanda's ovens has produced another unexpected detail. In the deposits examined, heather appears to have been an important fuel rather than charcoal dominating every firing. Dried heather roots could burn intensely, but using them in quantity meant collecting and transporting large amounts of material. So even a loaf of bread pulled another resource into the chain. If grain stopped arriving, the danger was obvious. But even if the grain arrived safely, Rome still needed labor, querns, ovens, time, and fuel before those stored calories reached a soldier's body. A sack of wheat was not warmth. It was potential warmth. Picture the quern turning while rain strikes the fort outside. Somebody works the stone. Somebody tends an oven. Somebody carries grain. The men on guard consume food produced by the labor of other men. The frontier army was constantly converting stored resources into usable endurance, and none of those resources appeared inside the fort by magic. The hearth did not begin at the hearth. The bread did not begin in the oven. The grain did not begin in the granary. Everything had to reach the fort through a larger network beyond the walls. One surviving letter makes that network unexpectedly human. Sometime around AD 97 to 105, a cavalry decurion named Masclus wrote to Flavius Cerealis. He wanted instructions about where his men were supposed to report. Then he added another problem. His men had no beer. He asked for some to be sent. Beer may sound trivial next to weapons and frontier strategy, but the request exposes how the system actually worked. An officer identified a shortage. A message moved. Someone had to locate the supply. Someone had to transport it. Someone had to account for it. Grain followed the same logic on a much larger scale. Another fragmentary Vindolanda document, dating to roughly AD 92 to 97, records grain being moved toward the fort in Roman measures. The text appears to involve Britons as suppliers and includes costs associated with carriage. Behind one warm barrack stood farmers, carts, animals, drivers, roads, payments, storehouses, clerks, and officers, deciding what had arrived and what was still needed. The fort wall was not the edge of the survival system. It was where the outside system delivered what the garrison consumed. Now picture the frontier from a commander's perspective. Inside one fort are hundreds of mouths. Every day they consume grain. Fires consume fuel. Ovens consume more. Footwear deteriorates. Clothing needs repair. Animals consume fodder. The demand continues whether the road outside is dry or deep in mud. The system works only while consumption and resupply remain connected. If transport slows for long enough, the garrison begins living more heavily on whatever has already been stored. That is when the granary stops being a building and becomes time. At Ambleside in Cumbria, a Hadrianic fort housed roughly 500 soldiers. 2 substantial granaries occupied part of its central range. Their unusually large capacity has encouraged the interpretation that the fort may have stored more food than its own garrison required, and perhaps helped support other Roman installations. Ambleside also sat within a road network linking military positions through difficult northern terrain. That is enough to reveal the larger structure. A Roman fort of hundreds of soldiers was not an isolated stone box. It was a consumer tied to roads, surrounding communities, agriculture, transport, storage, and administration. A long supply road was not just a line on a map. It was a fuse leading toward every oven and hearth, and Roman strength created its own debt. Every permanent fort meant men who had to be supplied even when no battle was being fought. Every additional mile of occupation created another mile of winter Rome had to feed. One delayed cart was not catastrophe. One missing shipment was not disaster. Storage existed precisely because deliveries could not be expected to arrive at the exact moment they were needed. But reserves were finite, and winter had a dangerous way of making several ordinary problems more expensive at once. There is no surviving tablet describing one perfect dramatic night when every part of this system failed simultaneously. We should not invent one. But the evidence shows exactly where winter could apply pressure. Imagine a storm settling across a northern fort. Cold rain drives across the defenses. Men returning from watch carry water into the barracks, on their clothes and footwear. The hearth is burning, but every hour it burns consumes more fuel. Elsewhere, ovens are doing the same. Outside the gates, the roads still exist, but a road in severe weather is not the same thing as a dependable supply line. The garrison cannot simply stop. One sentry must replace another. Animals still need care. Food still has to be prepared. Messages may still need to move. The commander cannot tell hundreds of soldiers to remain in bed until the weather improves. So the machine continues. Fuel goes onto fires. Wet garments come inside. Grain leaves the stores. Querns turn. Ovens heat. Men rotate through duty. And this is where winter becomes dangerous. It does not need one spectacular failure. It only needs to increase the cost of everything at the same time. Soldiers need more recovery after exposure. Clothing dries more slowly. Fires consume fuel while men rest. Ovens consume fuel while food is prepared. The same military population must also guard gates, maintain equipment, care for animals, carry messages, patrol roads, and answer orders. A full granary helps. It does not eliminate the work. A strong wall helps. It does not dry a sock. A sword helps. It does not bake bread. Now move one step outside the gate. A cart expected from elsewhere is delayed, not destroyed, not captured, simply late. At first, almost nothing changes. The stores absorb it. Then another delivery slows. The weather continues. Fuel consumption remains high. Men still have to eat. Clothing still has to dry. Suddenly the commander is no longer dealing with one delay. He is dealing with time. How much grain remains? How quickly is fuel being consumed? How much labor is available? How many men are carrying yesterday's exhaustion into today's watch? If pressure continued long enough, failure would move through the fort in the opposite direction from the supply chain. Road, storehouse, oven, barrack, soldier. Now return to the room where this story began. 8 men share the space. One has eaten food that required grain, storage, grinding, an oven, and fuel. His clothing had to be produced, supplied, repaired, and dried. His footwear represents leather, labor, transport, and maintenance. The fire beside him represents fuel gathered somewhere beyond the flame itself. Then the door opens. Another watch is due. If those men can no longer remain warm, fed, rested, and dry enough to perform their duties, the fort does not have to physically collapse for Rome to face a military failure. The walls can remain standing. The weapons can remain stacked, and the garrison can still begin to stop functioning as an army. That is the real reversal. Winter did not need to breach the Roman wall. It only had to break enough of the systems behind it. By the time a hearth finally became cold ash, the failure might have begun miles away in a delayed load, exhausted labor, consumed reserves, damaged equipment, or a resource being used faster than the network could replace it. The flame was only the final visible link. Behind it stood an empire, and that is why Roman winter survival should not be reduced to the idea that ancient soldiers were simply tougher than we are. They felt cold. They needed dry clothing, food, shelter, footwear, fuel, and rest. What made the Roman military system formidable was its ability, imperfectly but repeatedly, to coordinate those needs across permanent frontier positions. We usually judge an army by what it can destroy. How far can it march? How many enemies can it defeat? How quickly can it build a fort or break a line? But a permanent frontier asks a quieter and, in some ways, harder question. Can the army remain useful when nothing dramatic happens? Can it feed the same men tomorrow? Can it keep them warm enough to stand another watch? Can it replace what wears out? Can it continue doing this not for one heroic night, but across an entire season? Rome's answer was never perfect. It required labor, it required planning, it consumed enormous quantities of ordinary material, but it worked often enough to leave traces everywhere. Wooden tablets preserve requests for supplies and preparations for difficult weather. Thousands of pieces of footwear survive from the northern frontier. Querns still preserve the names of men connected to the daily work of turning grain into food. Granaries, ovens, roads, barracks, bathhouses, and heated elite residences reveal different layers of the same military landscape. None of those objects looks as impressive as a Roman soldier in armor. Together, they explain how that soldier could still be standing there. That is the final irony. Rome became famous for monumental roads, stone walls, disciplined formations, engineering, and conquest on a scale that still dominates our imagination. Yet on a bitter frontier night, all that power could narrow down to something painfully small. 8 tired men inside a barrack, wet footwear drying near the wall, food produced through hours of work, a door that would soon open for another watch, and a few embers glowing in the darkness. Rome's frontier was defended by walls, swords, and discipline. But on the coldest nights, all of it still depended on keeping one small fire alive. Subscribe for more hidden systems that kept ancient armies alive long after the battle ended.